Hey there, it's Irene, Lyon. Welcome to this video, to this YouTube channel, and to this world of healing trauma, nervous system health, and all things neuroplasticity. I want to talk to you today about books. So this is going to be a little different today. I'm not going to be giving you specifics around education. So if you were looking for that kind of content, check out my recent vlogs or the ones that I will be posting in the near future. And I wanted to record this because we get a lot of emails from people asking what books I recommend. And at this point in time, most of the books I have to recommend that I can confidently recommend are for education purposes only. They are usually more geared towards those in the health profession, so colleagues of mine, people in the mind-body industries, people who are already therapists, people who are somatic practitioners. However, there are some books that I believe are good for the very keen individual who wants to understand the deeper elements of the nervous system. Of course, I do teach you deeper elements within these videos, in my programs, within my free resources, but here are a few of them. So I've just plucked them off of my bookcase. I have a pretty big bookcase. Maybe I'll show you a snap of what that looks like. So this is not in any specific order, just what I've picked off, and here they are. So I've got maybe 10 or so of them. So the first one that is right in front of me is called The Trauma Spectrum. And this one, I'll show you that right there. I've mentioned it before. It is by someone by the name of Robert SCAER, Dr. Robert SCAER. He is a medical doctor, a neurologist. The foreword is actually written by Peter LEVINE. So check this one out. This one is, I actually love this book and I recommend it a lot because it gets into his subtitle, Hidden Wounds and Human Resiliency. And it really dives into the mechanisms of trauma. I'll read some of the subheadings. Trauma and health and disease, pre-verbal trauma. He gets into societal trauma. He gets into really intense chronic illnesses, autoimmune illnesses. He even covers things like stigmata, which is a more religious term, but it is when things pop up out of the body like bruising and wounds, not because someone gets hurt in current time, but it's the old somatic memories that are coming up and out. He gets into things like gastric reflux, chronic pain. It's one of my favorite books for referring to kind of the more significant chronic pain symptomologies that come out when we have stored traumatic stress. So again, this is called The Trauma Spectrum, Dr. Robert SCAER, and very much dedicated to his study and realizing that something was missing in the general medical world and diagnostics, etc. So that's one book. Next one, from another physician actually, this is The Body Keeps the Score. And this is by Dr. BESSEL KOLK. And the subtitle is Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. Now, I'll give you a little look into how I read things. I take a lot of notes when I read books within the front page and the back pages. So these are my notes. This one is great in that he talks about the importance of the body. I mean, it talks about it right in the title, The Body Keeps the Score. And what we know currently with the work that I do and my colleagues is that if we do not work with this body of ours, sensations, emotions, the movement patterns, the posture, we're going to miss the boat on really healing trauma at the deepest level possible. So the nervous system is the focus I have, and equally important that I focus on when I work with my students and my participants in my programs and workshops is we are working with the body. We are doing deep dives into the body, touching it, feeling it, changing the movement, having intention and attention on the body. So in BESSEL's book, he gets a lot more into the psychiatry, the psychology, because that is his specialty, and also the importance of working with body. He is a big believer in yoga, for example, to get into the body and really sort of revisit how the physical system holds stress, how it holds postural patterns of traumatic events, and how to awaken this system of ours. Now, the one thing that isn't in here, as I mentioned, there aren't practical exercises. It's more a overview of what he has found has worked, I should say, in his studies, in his work with his clients. He's done a lot of work with veterans and people with severe PTSD. So check this one out. It is, I will say, it's intense. So it's thick. So it's, again, one of these things that if you're interested in getting into more of the geeky science, he does some great examples talking about the amygdala and parts of our brain complexes and how it goes into alarm under stress. Things that you can find in other sources, but it's all combined into one piece. Next one is actually from one of my teachers, KAIN and Stephen TERRELL, and theirs is called Nurturing Resilience, helping clients move forward from developmental trauma. So based on the title, you will know that this is more based for practitioners, clinicians, people doing work in the field. In reading this and looking through it, it's really what I've learned with Kathy and Steve in our work together, in our training classrooms. So it's sort of an overview. It's almost a textbook of what we would learn in a very, we would call here in Canada, Cole's Notes version. In America, I think it's called Cliff Notes. So it gets into really what early trauma is. They talk about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. She gets into, her and Steve get into talking about the window of tolerance, something called the faux window of tolerance. So these are these windows that we live within depending on our early history, our trauma history. And they explain, of course, this is just one part of the book, but I'll give you a little insight, explains how when we have had early traumatic stress, we actually may not have a window of tolerance. We may have what's called a faux window of tolerance, which basically means that we actually do not live in regulation. We're constantly finding ways to control and contain our dysregulation, and we do it often with much success, and I say that kind of with quotes. However, it's also at the detriment of our physiology. So this is a great book that describes in detail the importance of working with regulation, the importance of working with touch, the importance of working with the stress organs. I actually did an interview with KAIN. I will post that in the Show More section of this video. It's a long form interview. And I also did an interview with Stephen TERRELL talking about his work with kids and basically children who behave badly, and what that means. And what we know now is that kids that are behaving badly, I say that with air quotes, it's usually not because they're trying to be little rascals, it's because they have underlying survival stress in their system that they're trying to get out, and they don't know how to get it out because they are immature animals. So if you want further watching and viewing with these two amazing humans and both my mentors, check out those videos. All right, next one. Probably the most recommended book I have recommended. It is GABOR MATÉ, another physician, another MD, When the Body Says No. Subtitle, The Cost of Hidden Stress. I got this book. I have the version from 2003. I think there's been other versions. This one is so old, believe it or not, it actually has his personal email address. I'm not going to read it out, but he had his personal email address in this book because he was fairly unknown when he wrote this. This book is an important read for anyone who is living with or knows folks who have chronic illness, autoimmune illness, cancer, heart disease, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, ALS, MS, these clusters of syndromes, as we would call them in somatic experiencing, that he really talks about in this book are a result of trapped stress, trapped emotion, And he wrote this before the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And I've got a book that I'll recommend if you want to dive deeper into that study. But he wrote this before the ACE study was really popularized. So he was seeing patterns in his clients, or really his patients. He was head of palliative care at Vancouver General Hospital, just up the road actually from where I live, right here in Vancouver, British Columbia. So he was head of palliative care. And he was noticing that the clients, the patients, I'm used to saying clients because that's who I work with, but his patients who were on death's door, dying, often very young, that they had a very similar story. Many people were unable to express their emotions. Many people were people pleasers. They only knew how to help other people. They didn't know how to help themselves. And so in this cycle of being constantly givers and helping and being that hero that can do everything and anything, the system breaks down. And the title, the body says no. Basically, the body will say no, it'll break down because it can't keep giving, it can't keep going. So again, very important read. I think every human should read this book because it really shows how we make ourselves sick. And there's an end to the book. He gets into, he calls it the 7 A's, talks about things like acceptance and anger. He talks about the power of negative thinking. Yes, I just said that, the power of negative thinking, why it is so important to allow ourselves to sense and feel reality and not sugarcoat everything. So again, great book. The next one is another one by GABOR MATÉ. This one, at least the Canadian version, is called Scattered Minds. And the subtitle, A New Look at the Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder. Again, I read this many, many years ago. This is 1999. He wrote this before When the Body Says No, but when you get into the texts, he was kind of working on them, I think, at around the same time. I recommend this book, again, for anyone who is a parent, anyone who knows that they have trouble focusing, paying attention, school teachers. It really gets into, as he says, the origins and healings of ADD. He talks about his own story, which is incredible. His own story of dealing with attention deficit disorder, his own dealings with addiction, his history. He was brought up, he was a baby when the Second World War was happening. He was born into a Jewish basically Hungary, Budapest. Nazis came in. I think it was like I don't know if it was the day he was born, but very much around the time when he was born. So if you can imagine the terror, the unsafety, the uncertainty that his mother and his physical system was feeling in that time, in that era. And he speaks about how that early imprint has really impacted him as a human being, as an adult, and of course the healings of that and what he has seen in his private practice as a doctor. So again, amazing book if you want to understand how our system, not just our brain, but our entire nervous system and our behavior is impacted by chronic stress, early adversity. Again, that book and When the Body Says No, and all the books I've already mentioned, they all connect really beautifully with the research that we're seeing. Again, the research, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that shows that when we have unhealed early and developmental trauma, early adversity, later in life, it will impact us either from a mental, psychological level, a psyche level, or a physical level, or relational level. All right, next book. This one's a little different. This one has a great history for me. Spontaneous Healing by Dr. Andrew WEIL, How to Discover and Enhance Your Body's Natural Ability to Maintain and Heal Itself. Now this book, the pages are so dark, 1995. So this was pre-GABOR MATÉ, pre any of this. This was actually the very first book I ever picked up when I got interested in the mind-body connection. At the time I picked this up, I was having some skin issues. I talk about my skin on my website under the About section, so check that out if you want to read about my history and how I've healed various things. But I picked this up looking for answers, really. And while nothing in this book helped what was going on with my system, that part came later in my journey, there is some amazing stories in here. And if anything, the first chapter, titled Right in My Own Backyard, is an amazing story about the use of osteopathic medicine. Some of us might know this as certain types of craniosacral therapy, and how when there are things off in our bones, in the way that our skull is aligned, and even in the way that our skeleton is aligned, it's going to impact the nervous system, the central nervous system, and how those nerves impact, in this case, the gut. So again, it's an older book. I would say that some of it might be outdated. However, it is one of those kind of classics that I don't think will ever die. Great book, fairly easy read, and lots of good stories about just his experience as an MD. He is also an MD who left the general medical field because he just couldn't work in that world. He had to be more alternative. He had to look at food and alternative traditions, which now are just commonplace. Okay, next one. This one's a little different also. It's called Nurture Shock. Nurture Shock. Subtitle, New Thinking About Children. This is written by Bronson and Ashley Merryman. And this one is great in that it really explores things that we would think are opposite for raising kids. And what I will say, the very first chapter is titled The Inverse Power of Praise, and I'll read the subtext. He writes, sure, he's special, meaning the child, but new research suggests if you tell him that, you will ruin him. It's a neurobiological fact. I read this years ago. Again, this is written in 2009, so well over 10 years ago. I can't remember why I originally picked it up and read it, but I wanted to read it. And this first chapter about how praising children will ruin them is worth reading, not just for parents, but for anyone who works with kiddos. If you have nieces, nephews, if you have grandkids, it shows what occurs when we put too much emphasis on kids doing things right. So again, I'll just give you that as a little teaser. I recommend the entire book. Again, it's called Nurture Shock by Bronson and Ashley Merryman. Okay, next one. We got 3 more. Next one is called Scared Sick. Scared Sick. The Role of Childhood Trauma in Adult Disease, written by KARR-MORSE and co-written with Meredith WILEY. This one is an amazing book. This was written in 2012. If you want to really understand the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is the research that backs up most of those other books that I talked about in relationship to human health, mental health, physical health, relational health, this is the one you want to read. It's very well researched. It's very easy to read. I read this when I was assisting in somatic experiencing trainings, and I remember one of our instructors saying that this book it just should be mandatory reading if anyone is interested in understanding the research behind early traumatic stress and how that creates chronic illness later in life. Of course, as we know, just because we have early trauma doesn't mean that we have to succumb to these illnesses. Of course, we have to do the work, which is what I do and what my colleagues do. We have to work at the nervous system level, at the body level, but it is very important, I have found, for people to understand the theory on why and how our systems break down and how that early imprint really impacts us, and essentially why we need to work at this deep nervous system level. All right, that stack's getting bigger. This stack is getting smaller. Okay, this is another one. It's a smaller book. It's called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, and he is a reporter. and the subtitle on homecoming and belonging. It's a shorter read. Still, I have lots of notes in here. And it really talks about the importance of community, the importance of connection. He talks a lot about how things shifted after 9/11 and how it actually brought people together. So he gets into some of the research, and it's just a lovely, easy read on why we need to shift how we live and work and are in our Western society. This was written in 2016, so it's not that old. But again, just a lovely book on a war reporter's view of the world. He talks about how he came back from being in the desert in the Middle East, and he was finding out that he had PTSD. He didn't realize that that's what he had. And he started to look at the healing of his system and how community was so important. He talks about how when men and women are at war, they actually do very well mentally because they're together. They have comrades, they have a purpose, they have direction. And when they come home, that is when things kind of fall apart, because that direction, that purpose, that connection, living with everyone, it shifts and changes. And so he talks about just that immense need for human connection. All right, next two books I'm going to show you both at the same time. They are by Norman Doidge. One is called, the first one, The Brain That Changes Itself, and the second one, The Brain's Way of Healing. These are, again, thicker books, written also by a medical doctor, an MD, Norman Doidge. And it's all about, as he says in this one subtitle, remarkable discoveries and recoveries from the frontiers of neuroplasticity. And he really put on, the map this concept of neuroplasticity in our current day and age. He talks about stories of doctors and therapists and people who he calls neuroplasticians, Dr. Moshe Feldenkrais being one of them, someone that I haven't studied from Moshe Feldenkrais specifically, but I have studied his work, which is the Feldenkrais method. He talks about the immense capacity for our brain and nervous system and the human body to change, even when horrific accidents, problems occur to the system, that we can regenerate and we can repair and rewire so much. So these two books are, again, meaty in tech language, and they're also written from story, talking about people's experiences, doctors, etc. So again, if you're a nerd and you like neuroscience and you want to learn about how things are changing out in the field, definitely check those out. All right, the last book I have here is, last but not least, one from Peter Levine, Waking the Tiger. He has another book, I don't know what happened to mine, I might have given it to someone, called In an Unspoken Voice. And of course, Peter has more than two books, but Waking the Tiger was really kind of his first writing about his discoveries. He calls it Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. And this one gets into sort of his first levels of discovery. I'm just trying to find the date that this was written. Where are we? 1997. So he talks about his discovery of why humans end up with PTSD and why animals in the wild do not, hence Waking the Tiger. He talks about the first client he ever had named Nancy. I talk about Nancy actually in another video, I'll post it below as well, and how he was able to uncover and have her realize that an old shock trauma, an old tonsillectomy where she was pinned down, held down, and couldn't fight and escape when she was really young, was the cause of her post-traumatic stress, her what we would call now fibromyalgia, migraine headaches, severe PMS, anxiety, that her symptoms and her syndromes as a young adult in school, grad school, were due to this stored traumatic stress from when she was really, really young. And so it talks about him discovering that. There are some other stories in here as well. There are a few exercises, really basic exercises. Many of them are things that I have talked to you and taught you through this YouTube channel. Some of you who are my students, you will have learned some of these. I do have a playlist with some of my audio neurosensory exercises. I'll post that below as well if you're interested in those. But again, Peter Levine really is one of the leaders in what we call the new traumatology. That is what most of these books talk about, which is the importance of working with the body, the trauma that is stuck in the body, in the organs, in the tissues, in the postures of ourselves, in our behaviors, in our actions, in our relationship to others, with the world around us. So he really kind of put that on the map. Of course, it's one of the things I am trained in. It's called somatic experiencing. For instance, KAIN, the book I mentioned, Nurturing Resilience, and Stephen TERRELL, they too are somatic experiencing practitioners, so they are my colleagues. Robert SCAER, the first book I mentioned, Trauma Spectrum, of course, his book, the foreword was written by Peter Levine. So there's a lot of intersections between these books. They sort of feed one another. Of course, I have dozens and dozens of other books that I have on my bookshelf, but in terms of a way of starting, this will take you a little while to get through. But if something really popped in your mind when I mentioned one of these books, if you're someone who likes to read, you like to get into paper and read and make notes, definitely check out what you were drawn to, what kind of sparked up your mind and your interest. I hope this has been useful. I hope that this has given you a little overview of what I have read over the past decade and more, what has offered me insight, what I refer my students and clients to all the time. Maybe we'll do another one of these with another stack of books. Let me know in the comments if this has been useful. Let me know if you've read some of these books, what you've taken out of these big writings with information and stories and research. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for listening to a very different kind of video today, and we will see you next week with another video. Bye for now.